Hey Nika, how's it going?
I'm good, Jamie. How you doing?
I'm well, thank you. For those that don't know anything about you, can you give us a bit about yourself, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Where to start? So my background is more in kind of private sector strength and conditioning, and I worked at Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning for about 3 years. Went off to Springfield College and got my master's in exercise and sport science. And throughout that entire process, pretty much since I graduated undergrad from the University of Vermont in 2014, I'd been competing as a professional javelin thrower as well. So both you kind of physically experience sport and then through coaching also. And now I actually work for a sports technology company called Perch. And we're a velocity-based training device, essentially. And so I'm the head of sports science here, so I take charge in a lot of the content side of things, but we're a smaller company, so marketing, communications, sales, everything is kind of interrelated. But it's been a lot of fun, and I get to lean on kind of my strength coaching background and exercise science background to kind of educate and make it all kind of come to fruition.
That's awesome. So you've got a diverse set of skills.
Yeah, I like to think so. It's more diverse every day, I think. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun. We're kind of learning as we go, and it's just been a good experience. And I think ultimately, I like to call myself kind of a student, kind of across the board. So if I learn something new every day, if I'm failing, I'm learning. If I'm succeeding, I'm still learning. And so I think that ultimately, every single day it brings kind of a new and unique challenge, and both within Perch and outside of it too. And so I think coaching, definitely experienced that. Selling stuff, definitely experienced that. Educating folks, kind of definitely experienced that as well. So it's been a really good kind of holistic, I think, experience across the board. But yeah, dynamic skill set. I like to say.
Mm.
Yeah.
In terms of being an athlete, a coach, and now a business person, have there been any individuals that have strongly influenced you within your career path?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot actually. I don't know if I can name them all. Like okay, let's bucket them. From a familial perspective, my family, mom, dad, obviously. My mom passed away when I was a kid, and she just kind of had this kind of grindstone, work hard kind of mentality, which has always been really inspiring. My dad, one of the most humble people I know, super inspiring as well. From like a professional kind of aspect as well, obviously Mike Boyle himself was super huge influence on my career. And then the tree that he kind of developed has kind of impacted it as well, obviously too. So anyone from my folks over at Movement is Medicine, Scott George Ackles, Kevin Carr, and then my personal strength coach. Who was a good friend, also part of the Boyles tree, Jill Zeller. And then she's now out at USC in California, but she's phenomenal. One of the most positive people and greatest coach I've ever kind of come across. But yeah, I mean, I think there's ultimately kind of too many to name, but those are definitely kind of the heavy hitters, I'll say. Now, from like a business kind of perspective as well, I think I'm more so now leaning on women in the space, I think. So there's an organization called Women in Sports Technology that was founded by a woman named Mary Lou McFarland. And she has spent her entire career in sports technology and is really trying to change the ratio of men to women kind of in this particular field. I think you find in strength and conditioning and sports technology and anything kind of remotely related, it's predominantly male dominated. And so she's very much so influential in that field. And so trying to take some lessons from her and help change the ratio.
For sure. That's brilliant. So you mentioned now that you're working for a company called Perch. That's a velocity-based company. So very quickly, for those that don't know what velocity-based tech is, can you explain it for us, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So velocity-based training is essentially a modality of strength training that instead of depending on a load based on kind of an arbitrary percentage of a one rep max, we are prescribing loads based on velocities. And so instead of saying like, hey Jamie, I want you to hit 80% of your 1RM today, if you come in and feel great, that prescribed 80% might feel a lot closer to that day's 62%. So we're not providing a stimulus that's strong enough for the adaptation that we're trying to train for. On the flip side of that, if you haven't slept in a couple days, maybe you're sick, maybe you're tired, and that prescribed 80% feels a lot closer to 98%. And I'm asking you to do that for multiple sets of multiple reps. And so we're risking overtraining, potential injury in that case. So instead of saying that, I can use that 80% as a guideline. But ultimately, kind of my end all be all is going to be, listen, Jamie, hit 80% if you can, but ultimately I want you to stay in between 0.5 and 0.75 meters per second. And you have a device that measures that. So if you stay within that range, we know for a fact that you're going to gain the adaptation that we say we're gaining. And so it enables us to train with increased specificity for those adaptations that we want to get out of our athletes on a day-to-day basis. And it allows us to train those athletes to their abilities on that day as well. So it's just a little bit of increased specificity. It enables, the athlete to kind of auto-regulate their loads and the coach to kind of have an additional set of eyes, so to speak, on the weight room floor as well. So velocity-based training kind of in essence is just an additional kind of modality of strength training that bases loads on velocity and kind of speed of movement and quality of movement versus just plain load.
Especially with athletes, when there's so many variables that some coaches or themselves might not think of, almost like acts as a guide on what that athlete could be capable of that day. Certainly very helpful.
Absolutely. And I think it also it helps provide a roadmap too. And so if you think about, there's something called a load velocity profile, which ultimately just means the force velocity profile is a little bit more common, but load velocity basically just means the load at which a person is moving a specific velocity, or the velocity at which a person is moving a specific load. And this just kind of serves, you can essentially kind of build a profile of an athlete with a specific protocol, or you can do that just kind of over time with all the data points you're collecting. And you can ultimately kind of build a map of your athlete's abilities. And if you can do that, I think that you kind of serve your athlete almost better than you previously could, simply because you know their exact abilities, you know their efficiencies, you know their deficiencies, and you know how to train that specific athlete for the demands of their sport, in addition to what they need, right? And so you can kind of give them what they need instead of what you want to give them.
So when you're looking at this evidence based on what the technology provides, what parameters are you looking for as a coach?
I think it depends on a couple different factors. I think it depends on the demands of the sport. I think it also depends on the training age and the type of athlete that you're working with. And then so for velocity-based training specifically, we're gathering data points on the efficiency of movement. And so what that means is we basically get to see at what velocities athletes are lifting what loads and what percentage of their rep maxes that means. And what that kind of does is enables us to kind of gain a holistic view of the force development capabilities of that individual. And so when you're talking about sport, right, and you're talking about athleticism, you're talking about the ability to produce and generate force. And so there's more than load involved in that equation. You have to know the velocity, and if you don't, I think that we're just kind of missing a big puzzle piece. And so I think what we're finding from our the coaches that we're working with is that they're ultimately kind of saying, like, we want to use it constantly. We want to use it for every single set, every single rep, because if we don't, we feel like we've got blinders on. And so that's been like an interesting thing to see anecdotally as well. Essentially, the traditional kind of the traditional methods of implementing velocity-based training were more kind of based around what's called the linear position transducer. So it's a tether, and how quickly that tether unspools is essentially what provides that velocity readout. And then there's also something called an accelerometer, which we have kind of in our phones, but it's just a wearable, and how quickly that kind of moves through space is what provides that velocity readout. What the company I work for produces, what Perch produces, is a camera-based system. So it's 3D camera technology. We're tracking depth and displacement and time, and that's what's providing velocity readouts as well as power readouts if you input your weight correctly. And so basically, the camera sits on top of your weight rack and kind of passively collects the data. And so we make weight racks smart. And how it differentiates itself from any kind of like linear position transducer or accelerometer is that it is passive, it is less obtrusive, and it is kind of seamlessly integrated into your weight room. And so instead of having to set something up and strap it to your barbell or strap it to yourself, basically you just have to tap a tablet, log yourself in and start lifting, and you're going to get that output. And then it's also stored. And so ultimately it enables you to track that data consistently year round without having to worry about it. And I think that what we're finding is that the teams we're working with consistently, so like an LSU football or Duke football, and a number of others at this point too, basically those teams are saying that without this data, they feel like they're running blind. And without this data, they're not able to serve their athletes as well as they feel like they could, right? And so it provides an additional insight to the abilities of your athletes on a day-to-day basis.
Nice one. So you mentioned that one thing to consider when using that technology is the age and stage of development, or in other words, training age, right? So how could this technology best serve, let's say, a high school athlete or a youth athlete?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're talking about high school or younger athletes, right, we're talking about predominantly kind of neuromuscular development. And so what that means is just it's pattern learning still. And so you're not concerning yourself with kind of maxing out, and you're not concerning yourself with necessarily like a percentage of a rep max, because it's all kind of arbitrary, because it doesn't necessarily mean anything. This athlete is just trying to learn the movement. And so with velocity, which is really interesting, we're seeing with high school age athletes, it enables them to auto-regulate volume more than anything. And so if you're talking about learning a pattern, you need a lot of volume, and you need a lot of practice. You need that muscle memory, right? And so if you're saying for a high school athlete, like, oh, just do 3 sets of 8 reps, that their body might be capable of producing many more reps than that, but you wouldn't know unless you have a device measuring their fatigue levels. Velocity can come in and you can set a threshold. And if you fall below that threshold, that means that you're done with that set, or we need to unload a little bit and stay within that threshold. Again, for that specific adaptation that you're training for, absolutely. But then you also just are able to regulate the volume. And so what we see, which is really interesting with high school athletes, is they can come in day after day after day after day and produce, or replicate the sets and reps kind of day after day after day, because they're not necessarily muscularly fatigued. It's more of they're just learning that pattern still. So they're not necessarily fatiguing. They're just still kind of learning. And so because they're not lifting the loads that would otherwise kind of exhaust them. And so what we see with velocity, when you're talking about like auto regulation, like, hey, let's set this threshold. Once you fall below it, cut your set off. Once your first rep or your first 2 reps are not above it, then we're going to cut the sets off. And so it basically just enables you to, especially like younger athletes who are still kind of learning, it enables you to provide the appropriate volume for their training age, and rapidly kind of increase it.
No, it seems like a very useful tool. I was planning on asking, what does VBT tell us that adding weight to a barbell doesn't? And it just seems like the answer is everything else.
Yeah, pretty much. And it can tell you to add weight to the barbell too. So if you set your threshold, especially with Perch, we basically have visual representation of this. So if you set your threshold, if you're above that threshold, a rep is going to show up on an empty bar graph as yellow. If you're within that threshold, it'll show up blue. And if you're below that threshold, it'll show up red. So you get that visual feedback rep to rep as to whether or not you're within the appropriate range, or you have the appropriate load for that appropriate range. So yeah, so it can tell you to add more weight too.
I was talking about the now stage of your career, right? But diving back to your previous career as a coach, more or less, you had a bit of experience working at Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning. Actually, a lot of experience working at Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning. There's a debate in the strength and conditioning community of the effectiveness between unilateral training and bilateral training. right? What's your opinion on the matter? Considering that at Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning, there's a huge emphasis placed on that unilateral leg emphasis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you come down to it, and this was something that Mike always said too, if you're talking about an athlete, when is an athlete in any sport performing their sport in a bilateral fashion, right? In a bilateral stance, or in a, I mean, I think we thought of a few, right? And they're like rowing, occasionally gymnastics, but not really. And so I think for the most part, if you're talking about an athlete, and kind of training to kind of the most functional capabilities of an athlete, you're talking about unilateral training in some capacity or other. You're talking about rotational strength. You're talking about overhead strength, right? And so you're not necessarily talking about like heavy squats consistently. And axial loads are important, and they always will be. Being able to absorb force is important, and it always will be. At Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning, we always did trap bar deadlifts in a bilateral fashion. So it's not like he's not ever performing bilateral movements. It's just that there are better ways to improve strength and athleticism than just heavy squats. And I think that when it comes down to it, he's also running a business, and he's also has athletes for a finite amount of time. And so being able to train them quickly and intelligently in a way that enhances their performance on the field, doesn't detract from it, is not necessarily like loading them up. It's making sure that they have the stability and the strength in the more common movement patterns than a bilateral stance, basically. So we did a lot of split squats, and we did a lot of like RFE split squats, and we did a lot of single leg deadlifts, and we did a lot of sprint movements too. And really, it's like it just comes down to, and it's such like a buzzword now too, but it comes down to functionality. So if you can train an athlete in a functional pattern for their sport, it's as close to sport specificity in a supplementary strength and conditioning way as you can get. And I think that is exactly the intent behind it. Train smart.
Definitely, efficiency is key, especially when you only have those athletes for a short duration of time throughout the week.
Absolutely.
So when it comes to progressing young athletes to unilateral movements, give me an example of some exercises that are the best place to start.
Split squat is always the easiest kind of place to start. I think that you can set them up in that split squat stance. You can start them from the bottom up so that they have some familiarity with kind of that almost like 90-90 type of setup. And then you basically have them hold that pattern, and then from there progress to reps, and then from there progress to more of a lunging pattern, and just kind of familiarize them with generating or holding that position, generating that movement, and then absorbing that force and generating that movement as well. And I would say probably for body weight initially, then you can start loading them in a goblet fashion, and then you can split the two. And then from there, I'd say once they're pretty proficient there, move them into that kind of rear foot elevated pattern too, and kind of take more of the back leg out of it. I think that's probably the progression I would go with. I also think that single leg deadlifts are, I think that if you find someone who is extremely proficient at a single leg deadlift movement, they're probably a pretty good athlete. And I don't really know what the correlation there, what it actually comes down to. It's just it's what you see and kind of intuit, I suppose, after seeing so many athletes kind of come through the doors. But ultimately, any athlete who can kind of move in that fashion is going to be pretty strong, pretty stable, pretty athletic. But for that one, I think you progress that one from essentially almost like a kickstand type of supported movement, a reaching SLDL, and then you can start loading it with a single dumbbell and then two again. as well. So that's
For
what I
sure.
do.
I totally agree with you when it comes to like single leg deadlifts. Like I used to be
Yeah.
like, that's such a balancing act, all that kind of stuff. Like how can like holding 16 pounds in a dumbbell and going on one like prepare the hamstring for the demands of their sport? But of
Yeah.
course, that's where the athlete starts. You know,
Right.
there's been some pretty impressive feats of strength, especially with my young athletes doing single leg RDLs. You know,
Yeah.
where they're now moving similar to like maybe like 75% of their body weight on a single leg. You know, not only helps prepare the hamstrings for the demands of their sport, but ankle proprioception, of course, we're always moving on that single leg, like you said as well.
Yep.
So that's how we progress through the single leg patterns. But how about at the later stages when single leg strength becomes a bit more developed? Of course, with the big lifts, there's some relative to body weight goals that some strength coaches will have, for example, like 1.5 body weight front squat, 2 times body weight back squat, 2.5 times body weight deadlift. How about when it comes to the single leg? What's the equivalent?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that the jury might still be out on that one. And I think that warrants that's a question that warrants a lot more research as well. I think that when it comes to single leg strength, you're going to see an enormous range. But I mean, I've seen everything from body weight to 2x body weight, right? From talk about like a hand supported safety bar split squat, right? And Devin McConnell at UMass Lowell, also part of the MBSC tree, but he did some really incredible stuff with his hockey athletes there, in the hand supported fashion and single leg stuff too. And it's so impressive to see. So I think that you have to kind of think about, and I think this is what I mean too. The traditional lifts aren't, or traditional powerlifting lifts, right, aren't necessarily functional in a sports performance setting. And so think about, from a sports performance setting, what is most important? How do you load that? And I remember Brajesh Patel at Quinnipiac, he and I had these conversations a lot. We talked about basically the progression almost kind of needs to look like um, improve stability and then improve strength, right? And so when we're talking about that, let's say for a single leg deadlift pattern, right? If we're talking about improving stability, you're talking about maybe some kind of like offset single leg deadlift pattern, right? And then when you kind of progress through the ranks there, we're talking about a hand supported, super loaded single leg deadlift pattern. And that's going to give you the strength. But the reality is you already have the stability because we've already moved through that progression. So now we get to load it. And I think that that's just like the natural progression in any lift in strength and conditioning, right? But I think that that's what makes the most sense to me. And again, like you're gonna run the gamut from 1x body weight, 2x body weight. Like I think that you're gonna see, and you're gonna continue to see, especially as this becomes kind of the predominant form of sports performance training, some really impressive feats of strength. And the really interesting part too, and Mike always talked about this at MBSC, but because someone has a split squat of 1.5 times body weight doesn't mean that they'll have a bilateral squat of 3x, right? That math never equals out, and it's mostly because your back ends up being your limiting factor. And so if you can kind of take that part out of the equation and just almost like try to isolate, right, the legs, then you get to just improve strength and functional strength.
I really appreciate your time. But before we stop there, we're going to play a quick game.
Yeah.
Okay. This game is called Underrated, Overrated.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to list a number of things associated with either health and fitness, and you're going to give me minimal explanation using the words underrated, overrated, as you compare it to the general consensus.
All right. Sounds good.
Nice one. Unilateral Schlinger leg training.
I think it's underrated.
For sure. Napping.
Oh, definitely underrated.
Olympic lifting derivatives.
I'm gonna say medium rated. Is that possible?
Estimated perfectly, I would say. Agility ladders.
Probably underutilized for the right reasons.
So true. People think it makes you faster, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Good
Talk
for,
about neuromuscular connection. That's all. That's what they're good for, right?
for sure. Multivitamins.
I'd say medium rated.
PNF stretching.
Probably underutilized again.
Yeah. Nordic curls.
Yeah, probably overrated.
Ice baths.
I think overrated.
For sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Totally. I'll never beat 8 hours of sleep, right?
Exactly.
Look, that's all for today, Nika. I really appreciate your time. Like I said, thank you again.
Yeah, no, Jamie, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It was good to catch up.